In 2014, a family of 5 purchased their dream home, but before moving in, they received mysterious and threatening letters from an anonymous source claiming to be observing them and their new home. Today, we explore the strangeness of the Watcher House. Welcome back to another episode of Down with the Strangeness, the show where every single week we dive into another piece of strangeness. I am your host, Ben, and I am excited to be back for another episode. Thank you for the awesome response to last week's episode on Polybius. That one was a lot of fun to make. It means a lot that you guys enjoyed it. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, make sure you go back and check that out when you're done with this one, obviously. Ladies and gentlemen, it is finally October, which means it is finally time to get into some scarier pieces of strangeness. So the next 4 episodes or so will all be within the realm of scary, but it's still very early in October, and we want to ease ourselves into the spooky season, so we won't be kicking this month off with some old ghost story or demonic possession. We'll get to those. But instead, today, we're going to kick things off with a story that doesn't need monsters or spirits to be scary. This story has that unique, real-life kind of scary. Today, I want to talk about the Watcher House. So, in 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus purchased what was essentially their dream home in Westfield, New Jersey. And if Westfield, New Jersey sounds familiar to fans of true crime strangeness, it's probably not because of this story. It's probably because that it was the location where, in 1971, family annihilator John List killed his mother, his wife, and his 3 children. But that is a topic for an entirely separate episode. Like I was saying, Derek and Maria thought they had found their dream home in Westfield, New Jersey. Maria was actually raised in Westfield, and their new home was only a couple blocks away from where she grew up. Derek was from Maine, not Westfield, New Jersey. He worked at an insurance company where he climbed the corporate ladder and eventually earned himself the position of senior vice president, which came with a salary large enough to afford the $1.3 million price tag on their new home located at 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey. And an important thing to note about the address is it's not something Boulevard, it's not Boulevard Street, it is just Boulevard, 657 Boulevard, Westfield, New Jersey. That's the address. Now, 657 Boulevard was an impressive home. It was built in 1905, and it had 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, and no less than 3 fireplaces, at least from what I could see in some of the pictures online. I'm not going to lie, this house is dope. YouTube viewers or listeners will be able to see some pictures of the home now, what it looks like most recently. I believe these photos are from 2019. Keep in mind that it is around 2019, so this is after some renovation, but still, it's an old home, it's a beautiful home. And Derek and Maria were not going to be alone in their big new home. The Broadduses had 3 children who were 5, 8, and 10 years old. The children were even debating about which of the fireplaces in the home that Santa Claus would use before they ever moved in. Now, as impressive a home as 657 Boulevard was, the Broaddus family did not move in immediately after closing on the home. Instead, they began performing a series of renovations. However, 3 days after closing, in June of 2014, a little after 10 p.m., Derek Broaddus was just finishing up some painting he had been doing in the home that evening. He went outside to check the mail. He didn't expect to find much because, like I said, they had only closed 3 days ago. Inside the mailbox, he found a couple bills accompanied by a white card-shaped envelope with "The New Owner" written in thick, clunky handwriting. Derek opened the envelope to discover a typed note inside, and this note is where our story begins to take its strange and dark turn. The note inside read, Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. How did you end up here? Did 657 Boulevard call to you with its force within? 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out. I see that you have already flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be. Tisk, 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 bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy. You have children. I have seen them. So far, I think there are 3 that I have counted. Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me. Was your old house too small for the growing family, or was it greed to bring me your children? Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me. Who am I? There are hundreds and hundreds of cars that drive by 657 Boulevard each day. Maybe I am in one. Look at all the windows you can see from 657 Boulevard. Maybe I am in one. Look out any of the many windows in 657 Boulevard at all the people who stroll by each day. Maybe I am one. Welcome, my friends. Let the party begin. And the letter was signed in a typed cursive font from the Watcher. Now, I want to mention here that is everything that is available from the letter. I believe it is in the appropriate order. I tried for a long time doing research for this episode to find the actual letters themselves online, photocopies, even transcriptions of the full letters, but that proved very difficult. And the best that I have come from a couple detailed sources who still leave out bits and pieces of information. For example, in addition to mentioning the contractors and the children, that initial letter also referenced the Broaddus' Honda minivan. And then all of these things kind of confirming that the Watcher is in fact watching. Now, the envelope had no return address and no indication as to where it came from or who the Watcher may be. Derek immediately ran inside the home after he read the letter. He turned off all the lights to prevent anyone from being able to see inside, and he called the Westfield Police Department to report the strange and threatening letter. The first officer who came to the home, the first on the scene, he read the letter, and his reaction was, quote, "What the fuck is this?" And that's a pretty understandable reaction to have. I am also married with 3 children. My children today, as I'm recording this episode, are pretty much the same ages with the same gap in age as the Broaddus kids at the time. So maybe that's why I throw this one personally into more of the scary category. But the idea of being watched by someone, contacted by that person, and then vaguely threatened by them, all while having them mention personal details about you, I think that's pretty damn scary, whether you have kids or not. Now, how do the Broadduses react, right? So they contact the police, but the first thing that they do, and they do it the very same night that they get the letter, they contacted the former owners, the family that they bought it from, John and Andrea Woods. They send them an email, and not only is this a logical first move, but the Broadduses had extra reason to contact the Woods, because if you remember how I said I couldn't find Watcher letters all the way through in its entirety, at least from a source that I trusted, there was a line in a letter that was referenced by a reliable source that we didn't cover, which gives much more reason to contact John and Andrea Woods, because there was this line in the letter. I asked the Woods to bring me young blood, and it looks like they listened. So Derek and Maria send an email to John and Andrea. Andrea responds the next morning telling Derek and Maria that just a few days before moving out, they also received a strange letter from the Watcher. They definitely agreed that the letter was odd, but theirs was much less threatening by their account. It was almost more thankful It made similar references to the general involvement of a Watcher family observing the house throughout the years. But John and Andrea claimed that they had received nothing from the Watcher in the entire 23 years that they had owned the home before that one, when they were selling it to Derek and Maria. So the next day, that day that Andrea sends the email, it's the day after Derek and Maria had reached out initially. The Woodses actually accompanied Maria to the police station to help inform on the investigation. And at that time, both families were told not to tell anyone about the letters, specifically anyone in the neighborhood, because their neighbors, based on the nature of these letters, were all now suspects. And this whole thing put the Broadduses on high alert, but it did not stop them from moving forward with their plans to move in and with their renovations. However, Maria would begin paying extra attention to the children when visiting the new home, yelling their names if they went out of sight or too far from the house. Derek even canceled a work trip because of this whole situation, and it's funny because he actually remembers giving a tour to a couple in the neighborhood during all this, when he's not supposed to disclose anything. He's just supposed to act normal, and he's giving a tour of their new home while renovations are going on to a couple in the neighborhood, when the wife of the couple taking the tour says, quote, "It'll be nice to have some young blood in the neighborhood." I mean, can you imagine being Derek Broaddus in that situation? Holy shit, right? The reference to young blood, which is pulled right from the letter, and maybe it's some weird regional thing. In New Jersey, maybe young blood is just a common thing, like bruh or something like that. But that would probably shake me a little bit too. And now 2 weeks later, the Broadduses have still not moved into 657 Boulevard, but renovations are still underway. And Maria stopped by the house to look at some paint samples and to check the mail, which is when she discovered a familiar card-shaped envelope with thick, clunky writing. They had received another letter. This time, the letter was addressed directly to Mr. and Mrs. Broaddus, actually misspelling their last name, spelling it Braddus, which that could be a sign of incompetence, or it could have been a bit of a slight. But regardless, this letter said, "Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy, and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what is in the walls yet? In time they will. 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of the house. Have you found all the secrets it holds yet? Will the young blood play in the basement, or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Will they sleep in the attic, or will you all sleep on the second floor? Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. It will help me know who is in which bedroom. Then I can plan better. All of the windows and doors in 657 Boulevard allow me to watch you and track you as you move through the house. Who am I? I am the Watcher, and have been in control of 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades. The Woods family turned it over to you. It was their time to move on, and kindly sold it when I asked them to. I pass by many times a day. 657 Boulevard is my job, my life, my obsession, and now you are too, Braddus family. Welcome to the product of your greed. Greed is what brought the past 3 families to 657 Boulevard, and now it has brought you to me. Have a happy moving in day. You know I will be watching." The letter, this second letter, also seemed to brag about having more intimate knowledge of the Broaddus' children. The Watcher identified both the birth order and nicknames of the children, saying things like, "I am pleased to know your names now, and the names of the young blood you have brought to me. You certainly say their names often." It also made a specific reference to one child who the Watcher observed painting on an easel inside the enclosed porch on the front of the home, asking, "Is she the artist in the family?" Now, obviously at this point, the Broadduses stopped bringing their children to the house altogether. And who wouldn't? you know? To be honest, at this point, they're not even sure if they want to move into this house. I know that it's a lot of money, and this is the kind of shit that nobody ever expects to deal with. But I would probably have a similar internal struggle making this decision myself. The renovations to 657 Boulevard were complete within just a few months, but the Broadduses were still struggling with this decision to move in. Derek had even gone as far as to price out trained German shepherds to keep at the home, as well as posting a job online for military veterans saying, quote, "All you have to do is work out in the backyard every day." But at the end of the day, the Broaddus family didn't want to feel unsafe in their new home. They didn't want to turn that home into a fortress or a stronghold. And if they needed any more help making this decision, then they got another letter, and that if they needed help, this is where it would come. Because they get yet another letter from the Watcher saying, 657 Boulevard is turning on me. It is coming after me. I don't understand why. What spell did you cast on it? It used to be my friend, and now it is my enemy. I am in charge of 657 Boulevard. It is not in charge of me. I will fend off its bad things and wait for it to become good again. It will not punish me. I will rise again. I will be patient and wait for this to pass and for you to bring the young blood back to me. 657 Boulevard needs young blood. It needs you. Come back. Let the young blood play again like I once did. Let the young blood sleep in 657 Boulevard. Stop changing it and let it alone. The Broaddus family decided not to move into their new home, and they instead move in with Maria's parents, who live not too far away from 657 Boulevard. The Broadduses continue to pay the mortgage, as well as do things like shovel snow and, probably most terrifyingly in this situation, respond to security system alerts at the home, which Derek actually said he did with a knife, just in case. And this entire ordeal was really starting to take a toll on Derek and Maria. The two found themselves fighting constantly and even needed to begin taking medication just to fall asleep. Derek recalls being, quote, a depressed wreck. And Maria, who began seeing a therapist during this entire thing, was officially diagnosed with post-traumatic stress stemming from the situation. About 6 months after the first letter arrived and shortly after the completion of the renovations, the Broadduses decided to sell their dream home at 657 Boulevard, having never had the chance to live inside. They initially listed it for more than they had paid to reflect the cost of the renovations, but word travels fast. One broker who emailed the Broadduses to tell them, I messed it up in the way that the Watcher does, who emailed the Broadduses to tell them that her client loved the house, but felt there were too many unsubstantiated rumors floating around. Now, at this point, to the Broadduses' credit, they not only, I guess, they kind of control the story about what potential buyers will know or hear about the home. But at the same time, they also build their credibility or their integrity a little bit, because they begin sending a disclosure letter to all potential buyers, kind of helping explain the Watcher's situation. And while this is big for the Broaddus' character, it's not so beneficial when it comes to real estate. The Broadduses did receive several offers on the home, but all of them well under the asking price. So at this point, Derek and Maria, consumed by the thought of how to handle their situation, begin thinking, what would they have done had the Woodses disclosed that initial letter that they received? That, if you remember, but we talked about this when everything kind of kicked off, right? They emailed John and Andrea Woods. The Woods tell them that they did get one letter just before they moved out, but they threw it away, kind of thought it was weird. The letter, or excuse me, the Woodses have always claimed that they never once felt watched by anyone, and they actually, in fact, they say they felt so safe in their home that they rarely locked the doors. But the Broadduses still felt that not telling them about this letter might have been enough to change their minds about the sale. So in June of 2015, just 1 year after buying the house, they filed a legal complaint against the Woodses, arguing that they should have disclosed that letter that they received the same way they had disclosed the fact that water would sometimes leak into the basement. Now, some states do require certain disclosures relating to death and other, to use our favorite word, strangeness, but New Jersey has no such law, and the Broadduses' lawsuit appeared very unlikely to go anywhere. The case then was eventually dismissed. So desperation really starts setting in, or continues to set in perhaps, with Derek even exploring the option of renting the house to the Department of Veteran Affairs, as well as a company that runs a halfway house. Neither of those panned out, and in the spring of 2016, they once again listed 657 Boulevard. This time, they even hosted a little open house, which this part is not crazy important to our story, but I just wanted to bring it up because it's interesting to me. Derek and Maria actually cleverly used the guest sign-in book from the open house to compare handwriting that was on the envelopes that came from the watcher. But again, that ultimately led to disappointment because they weren't able to identify the watcher, and they also were not able to get a satisfactory sale of the house. So at the end of the day, this results in the Broadduses once again being stuck with a beautiful home that they just couldn't live in. Now, a bit of good news kind of comes here when a family actually agrees to rent 657 Boulevard from the Broadduses. It's a family that had grown children, they had 2 large dogs, and they told reporters, quote, that they weren't worried about the watcher. But maybe not worried is a bit of an overstatement, because the lease actually contained a clause that would let the family leave at any time if there was ever another letter received, which brings us 2 weeks after that family moves in. Derek goes over to the property to address an issue they were having with squirrels nesting in the roof, when the renter handed him a familiar-looking envelope. Another letter, and this one read, "Violent winds and bitter cold, to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife, Maria. You wonder who the watcher is? Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. Good move. I watched as you watched from the dark house in an attempt to find me. Telescopes and binoculars are wonderful inventions. 657 Boulevard survived your attempted assault and stood strong with its army of supporters barricading its gates. My soldiers of the Boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the Watcher." This letter, which was much more aggressive and angry than the previous ones, continued by mentioning potential revenge against the Broadduses. Quote, "Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick day after day after day after day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet, loved ones suddenly die, planes and cars and bicycles crash, bones break." This letter even mentioned the new renters, which did worry them a bit, but fortunately for the Broadduses, the renters decided to remain in the home. Now, Derek and Maria take this letter to police, who kind of forced a little new life into the investigation. And again, we're talking about it on this podcast, which tells you that they ultimately came up empty-handed. 657 Boulevard, which at this point Derek described as a cancer, would be a daily source of stress, anxiety, anger, and fear for the Broaddus family until they finally sold the home in July of 2019. The Broadduses purchased the home at 657 Boulevard for almost $1.4 million, $1.3559 or something like that. They spent another $100,000 in renovations and continued to pay things like taxes and maintenance on the home from 2014 to 2019, including over $100,000 in property taxes alone. They sold the house for just $959,000. 657 Boulevard cost Derek and Maria Broaddus a lot of money and probably even more mentally and emotionally. And the identity of the Watcher has never been discovered, which leads us to theories, investigations, all of this speculation and wondering who the Watcher may be. And I'm sure that depending on how wild you want to get, that there are hundreds of potential theories as to who the Watcher was and why they were sending these letters. While researching this episode, I saw things like the Watcher letters were sent from a paranormal entity of some sort, or possibly even a manifestation from or within or of the house itself, which is paranormal in itself, I guess. Now, those stories or narratives may have helped with the spooky theme of October, but like I said, I don't think this story needs an otherworldly element to make it scary. We didn't go into a lot of detail because in the end, it was pretty unsuccessful and uneventful, but we did reference that there was an investigation done. So that's where we want to jump into things, right? There were actually investigations done, plural, with an S, because the police did their thing, right? Well, the Broadduses contracted with experts in a number of fields to help supplement the police investigation. And in the later days, with national attention placing a spotlight on the case, veteran detective Baron Chambliss was tasked with investigating the Watcher. And he said, our first possible solution goes back to the Woodses, John and Andrea. Now, while they had obviously been involved in investigated and on the radar, we'll call it, from an early stage in this whole thing, going with Maria to the police station the day after the first letter comes in, the police also brought in their 21-year-old son. He was ultimately cleared, but you can see through some of the references within the letters that it's not hard to imagine it being him, someone with knowledge of the home, an emotional connection that might help generate or spark some of that rage, having those issues with renovations, essentially changing the home that he grew up in and loved so much. The Watcher referenced changing what the home was meant to be. So it makes sense to me. And funny enough, this was one of my initial reactions upon learning and researching this case. I immediately went, before we got any further than the first letter, I immediately started wondering if the Woodses had any adult children, right, who might have grown up in that house. But like I said, the Woods' son and his parents, the whole Woods family, they were ultimately cleared. So I want to talk about another interesting suspect in all this. One night, Chambliss and his partner were sitting in the back of a van watching 657 Boulevard through binoculars. And at around 11 p.m., a car stopped in front of the house for a suspiciously long amount of time. Long enough for Chambliss to get suspicious, at least. He tracked the car back to a woman who lived in a nearby town. He discovered that her boyfriend actually lived on the same block as 657 Boulevard. The woman told Chambliss that her boyfriend was into, quote, some really dark video games, which I hate when they try to blame things on video games, but it does feed into the story, and it was, again, that was one of the first things that she told Detective Chambliss as he began investigating. So the boyfriend agrees to come in for an interview on 2 separate occasions, but fails to show up either time. Unfortunately, without enough evidence to force the issue or to push him, the boyfriend was no longer pursued by authorities. So that's one more real-life suspect that's perhaps not as directly tied to the Woodses, directly tied to the house as the Woodses or their son. But it's very strange that he just blew off the interviews after he agreed to them with police. And this will take us to maybe the most interesting suspect, and one that police pursued before national attention ever focused on the story, before Detective Chambliss was ever involved. They were focusing or looking at a neighbor by the name of Michael Langford. Peggy Langford owned the house next door to 657 Boulevard since the mid-60s, and she was living there with several of her adult children, including Michael. According to his brother Sandy, Michael was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young man. He would do things like walk through neighbors' backyards or peek into the windows of homes that were being renovated. But everyone from the neighborhood had grown to view it as kindness and innocence, even though it was strange. For instance, one neighbor said about Michael, "He goes out and gets the newspaper for me every morning." So while Michael may just be a strange but innocent guy, he's not actually the suspect directly. He simply brought the spotlight onto his family. You see, police obtained a DNA sample from one of the envelopes the Broadduses had received, and they found DNA belonging to a woman. So while Michael Langford received the initial suspicion, his sister Abby Langford was the one that received official suspicion, we'll call it. Abby was a real estate agent who may have just been upset about missing a fat commission check right next door, right? Police discreetly obtained a sample of Abby's DNA from the water bottle, but it was not a match for the DNA on the envelope. And I find this one particularly interesting, and I'm not alone in that. Derek and Maria, who were so surprised when police informed them that the Langfords had been ruled out, that they actually considered filing civil charges against the Langfords with the motivation of forcing the issue and bringing more attention, but they ultimately decided not to. Beyond the police investigation, the Broaddus family employed security firms, handwriting analysts, and even renowned forensic linguist Robert Leonard, who was interestingly formerly a member of the band Sha Na Na. Derek even went as far as convincing his friend in the tech industry to connect him with someone capable of hacking into his neighbors' computers to look for any evidence of them being the Watcher, although he would never follow through with this plan because it was much more illegal and complex than I think he realized when he came up with it. So, as with a lot of stories we'll discuss on this podcast, the official investigation remains unsolved, and we don't know the identity of the Watcher. But that does not stop people from theorizing and guessing and taking the investigation further. And there are a couple theories that are equally, if not more, convincing than anything uncovered in the official investigation. One of those theories is that the Watcher is not one person. Instead, this theory claims that the Watcher is multiple people. So the Watcher, what if instead of being one person, the Watcher is an identity being created and kind of perpetrated by multiple neighbors, or even the entire neighborhood? What if all of Westfield is in on it? And I know that sounds crazy. That starts to sound very paranoid. But there are a few strong reasons to consider this as a possibility. If you remember, back when the Broadduses were going through the saga of listing the home for sale, of failing to get a deal, calling companies about halfway houses, looking for people to rent, and all of that, I mentioned one option that we would cover later. And in the midst of their desperation to end this real-life horror movie, the Broadduses' real estate lawyer made an interesting suggestion. He suggested that they work with a developer to split the lot at 657 Boulevard into two separate lots, demolishing the existing house and building two homes on each, or one home on each lot, or two separate homes. Now, subdivisions like this were on the rise in Westfield, and 657 Boulevard was one of the largest lots in the neighborhood, so it did make some sense. But unfortunately, many locals were not crazy about this new subdivision trend, and splitting 657 Boulevard into two lots would actually leave each lot about 2.5 feet short from the Westfield mandated 70 feet minimum that Westfield requires. So the Westfield Planning Board was needed to grant an exemption to the mandate. So when the Broadduses submitted their application and the proposal was publicly announced, the Westfield Facebook group exploded. There were some people who expressed sympathy for the Broadduses, but that was far from the only position being taken. Some people expressed tough love, referencing the inherent gamble in real estate. Other people attacked the Broadduses, questioning their finances, their relationship, even accusing them of being deceitful in all of this. And in January of 2017, the planning board met to make a decision about the Broadduses' application after having already dedicated a 3-hour hearing to the proposal. More than 100 residents showed up. One man even retained a lawyer to legally fight against the proposal if it were to make it past that meeting. The Broadduses' attorney explained that the 3-foot exemption was as narrow as the easel that he was using to display a map in the courtroom. The map that he was displaying was being used to show multiple other lots that had been given the exact same type of lot size exemption that the Broadduses were asking for. This meeting lasted 4 hours with presentations and rants from lawyers and neighbors. Surprisingly, the Watcher was barely a topic of conversation. They focused primarily on what the Broadduses stood to gain financially, what the neighborhood felt that it was losing aesthetically and historically, which I can understand, although I'd probably be on the side of letting them subdivide. I can understand where the nostalgic concerns come from. And at 11:30 p.m. that night, the board unanimously rejected the proposal, and a New Jersey judge would later deny the Broadduses' appeal of the decision. Interestingly, the very next year, in 2018, the same planning board approved the split of another lot in Westfield that actually required size exemptions much larger than the 3 feet requested by the Broadduses. And this goes against the idea of preserving history, and it aligns pretty well that the Broaddus family was not wanted for whatever reason in Westfield. And it makes sense that the very same neighbors who were upset about the loss of history could also be upset about the loss of history with the renovations. And a big area of frustration, that was a big area of frustration in the Watcher letters. One of the letters said, quote, "Are you one of those Hoboken transplants who are ruining Westfield?" The people of Westfield could have viewed the Broaddus family as undesirable for the standards they had for their neighborhood. Residents of the area were remembered saying that they were worried about their property value and the stigma of the neighborhood. So this could all explain why it's hard to identify who, because it's not one who, it's a lot of them. All watching, all getting information, all working together. And one last thing that really has me considering this multi-neighbor collusion as a possibility. And this was something that was revealed by Detective Chambliss, going back and looking at records of the case. When police first learned of the situation, they instructed the Broadduses and the Woodses to remain quiet while they worked on the investigation, as all the neighbors were suspects. Mayor Andy Skibitsky assured the public that even though the police hadn't solved the case, their investigation had been exhaustive. And that's a quote. And that's interesting because Detective Chambliss took over the case and he found that most of the neighbors had never once even heard from the police, which is kind of weird for an exhaustive investigation to overlook dozens, if not hundreds of people who can see 657 Boulevard from their fucking kitchen table, right? Maybe the police were in on it, or at least enough people within the police department were in on it. Coincidence or not, it's absolutely something worth noting. But there is another theory that I want to close with. As believable as the multi-neighbor and potential police collusion is and all this, this next theory has its own believability. And that's, what if the Broadduses faked the whole thing? Now, why would they do that? If you're like me, that was the first thought you had when this idea was presented, but it's not the craziest thing in the world when you think about it. You see, on Christmas Eve of 2017, some of the families who had been a little more vocal in their criticisms and other negative opinions of the Broadduses received strange letters themselves. Letters in the same style as the Watcher that had been hand-delivered. One family who received such a letter said it was, quote, weirdly poetic. The writing style was compared to that of the Watcher. The letter accused the families of making inaccurate claims about the Broadduses and included several references to acts of domestic terrorism likely to indirectly threaten the recipients of these letters. And the letters were signed from friends of the Broaddus family. It turns out that those friends of the Broaddus family who sent those letters were actually sent to those families from Derek himself. He claims he only did it because he was frustrated with the neighbors' treatment of him and his family, which had reached its breaking point when the Planning Commission denied the request to split the lot. He also said that he did it without Maria's knowledge and that it is the first and only time he has ever done anything like this. but it is quite suspicious of him. At minimum, it's a stupid move. Even if he didn't write the original letters, even if he's not the Watcher, I can't see why anyone would do this. Consider the psychological trauma that this caused Maria and their children. If you think about that, it seems highly unlikely that any goal Derek had for doing this would be worth taking things as far as he did. Some people think that Derek might have had buyer's remorse. Perhaps the Broadduses didn't realize the financial situation they'd be putting themselves in until it was too late. But then you wonder, this letter saga kicked off immediately, and they didn't sue the Woods family for another year. If that was really their idea or thought behind it, you'd think that would have happened much sooner. Although between like I said, buyer's remorse, thinking that they didn't recognize what their financial situation would be. Do you think about this? Between the renovations, hiring the investigation or the investigative professionals, paying the taxes, for God's sake, and all of that, it doesn't really make it seem like money was that big of a concern for them, especially with the loss they took when they sold the home. Others suspect some sort of insurance fraud, which still comes at it from a financial angle, but not one from desperation, like trying to back your way out of a sale, but more one from greed, which almost makes the Watcher's letter poetic when he referenced greed being what brought them to the house. And another theory is that Derek sent the letters in hopes of securing a movie deal or something along those lines, essentially seeking fame for the whole thing. And that seems less likely than the money troubles or even the insurance fraud to me, as it's no guarantee that your story gets picked up. And again, the massive mental and emotional trauma that you're causing your family, it just doesn't seem like it's worth it. But I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's unlikely because there were interest in movie rights to this story fairly early on once it started to make its way out of New Jersey. We'll say, in terms of media coverage. The Broadduses actually turned down several offers while going through this whole ordeal, again, early in the process. Another thing that tells me that they weren't looking for a movie deal, because why wouldn't they have taken one of the 7 deals offered to them in probably 2015? Why not take one of those, right? And the Lifetime Network actually released a movie called The Watcher that lifted from the Broadduses' story so heavily without any of the rights that they were actually served with a cease and desist letter from the Broadduses. In 2008, after a ferocious bidding war involving 6 different studios, Netflix acquired the rights to the story, and a miniseries is expected to release next year, 2022. So, who is the Watcher? Is it the spirit of the home? Is it a spirit within the home? Is it one of the neighbors? Is it all of the neighbors? Is it just an elaborate hoax by a greedy or desperate man? We may never know. And there's been no further contact from the Watcher since the home sold to its new owners, and the Broadduses are doing their best to move on in life. I'm sure that Netflix money will help heal those wounds a little bit. That's going to do it for today's episode, guys. That is the story of the Watcher, a story that doesn't really need ghosts or demons or monsters to be scary. Join me next week for another scary piece of strangeness. I am your host, Ben. Thank you so much for listening today. Please remember to rate and review. Check out all the social medias. Join the email list. Hop on the Patreon. Those are all fun ways to support and stay connected. I cannot wait to do this again with you guys next week. We'll get another spooky one. This time we're dipping our toe in. Maybe we'll try to go waist deep next week with another scary or spooky piece of strangeness. I can't wait to do it again with you guys. I will be back next week. And until then, keep it strange.